Lisa, I'm so excited to have the next conversation in our series about contextual banking, this one about data transparency. How much time do you have, Lisa?
I've got a good 20 minutes, so let's have at it.
This is a conversation that could go on for a long time because there is certainly a lot to talk about. But let's start with what's going on in Washington, D.C. We've got the CFPB that has taken comments about some of the things that they are contemplating with respect to their role in regulating data access by fintechs and to banks. At the same time, you've got the clearinghouse trying to establish standards and assessment tools for fintechs to better enable the sharing of data between banks and fintechs. So there's an industry movement trying to, I think, avert any sort of regulation that might have some unintended consequences for either side, depending upon whether you're a fintech or a bank. So where do you stand in terms of the thinking around data transparency, what the impact is going to be to innovation, depending upon which way the regulators roll?
Well, it's an unknown, and so I have the same crystal ball that everybody else has. But with respect to, benefits to consumers, it's clear that benefits to end users, in my view, will be, most facilitated by the most liberal application by the various regulators on fintechs in terms of emburdening them as and regulating them as if they are banks, because they are not. What I do think is fair and right is for a baseline expectation, if you are holding, accessing, or even asking for or passing through consumers' data, there's incumbent upon you as a participant in the ecosystem to stand behind your service and your data practices. So, to answer your question, I think there will be a flourishing of innovation and services to end users. And I think that there is going to be a coming together of financial institutions and third parties for the benefit of consumers.
And I mean, we're obviously seeing that happen today. I think the crux of the issue, at least as I'm, interpreting what the CFPB's position is, that it's a complex ecosystem that consumers may not understand entirely. Therefore, there needs to be some protection on their behalf for how much data they're sharing and whether or not the parties they're sharing it with are getting the right data, the most accurate data, in order for those decisions that they're making when they're sharing that data to be right. I mean, it is a complicated issue.
I think that that's actually a true and fair approach, that consumers, and when, at FISPAN, when we think of consumers, we think of, individual consumers and also businesses, that it really shouldn't be incumbent upon the end user to have a detailed understanding of rules, regs. And fundamentally, I think that what consumers need to be made more aware of, by virtue of whether it's regulatory intervention or practices, is explicit consent at the time of data provision or data sharing as to what data is being provided to whom and for what purpose. In my view, it's as simple as that. Like, that's the simple outcome that we want to get to, and the litmus test for any legislation that's, in furtherance of that goal.
Right. But I also think that, the industry is trying to create standards, because that is lacking today for how that access happens. And the ability for fintechs to understand, what is a safe method of accessing that data on behalf of that consumer or business. And I think that's fair.
This is going to be a boring conversation because I don't think anybody would disagree with that, right? So, if it's a sensitive piece of data, education of consumers about what a sensitive piece of data is, I think most consumers do understand, hey, my name and email address, maybe less so, address, certainly social security number, those sort of things, those should be encrypted, tokenized. But as a consumer, am I really in a position to opine or, be knowledgeable about the technical details of how this token is exchanged, what level of, hashing and encryption? I think that that is an ask too much of end users.
I agree. So let's talk about the use of data in the development of products that are for the benefit of consumers, and what we describe as the ethical use of data. Which is obviously giving permission, but giving permission for just the right amount of data to inform some of those decisions. Who decides what information is just enough?
The consumer needs, the user, the holder, and the owner of the data needs to decide what is just enough. And the requester of the data, it's incumbent upon them to put a justification for what they're asking for. But what we're seeing is, fintechs and third parties hoovering up as much data as possible and extracting it from financial institutions, and then mixing it and analyzing it with third-party data sources, and in fact selling it back, whether it's to the financial institution itself or the consumer in some way as insight. And that it's not that practice needs to stop, it's that practice needs to be made clear.
And be made clear to the consumer so that they're consenting.
100%. And what we're seeing is financial institutions, who are ultimately the source of much of this data, themselves are so hesitant to take action upon it, that it's just this wide open opportunity that we actually see financial institutions as almost more willing to buy back the insights from a third party than create the insights themselves. And I think that's going to change over the next little while in the industry.
And what is going to force that change? Consumer sentiment, regulators saying enough is enough?
No, I actually think it's going to be banks seeing that there's widespread acceptance by consumers that the benefit to the end users, the bank's customers, is great enough. And so the opportunity, as regulations become more clear and as standards starts to evolve and consumers become more comfortable, I think banks will start to take the helm and start to own more of the value chain around the data processing to deliver insights.
I do think, we'll talk a little bit about, consumers' comfort level with engaging with other non-bank parties with respect to financial products and financial information. We obviously know that that's true, but consumers trust their bank. And I think that's also part of the crux of this, which is, banks recognize that consumers trust them with their data. Therefore, the concern is that, if in fact processes and standards aren't sufficient, if that data somehow gets compromised, it's the bank that will be to blame, even if the consumer provides permission.
And I think that that's 100% true. And that's the one area where I'm 100% on the side of the banks for clear regulations for third parties. And, in our white paper from a few years ago, we likened it to, as a consumer, you're going to push yes when asked, hey, do I want my bank to share this information with this third party? Because in the heat of the moment, that's providing some instantaneous benefit to you, whether it's applying for a loan, seeing if you can get that underwriting better deal for your car, your car purchase, whatever it may be at the instant. You are going to be inclined to say yes. And then subsequently, next week, next month, some period down the track, when something goes wrong and that data has come back to be misused or you become aware of it, as a consumer, your natural inclination is to blame your FI, right, not the party that, actually did you wrong, so to speak. And that's where I think a fair and equitable regulatory environment that has some teeth and enforcement behind it for other players in the data ecosystem will go a long way.
Do you think that consumers are checking yes as much as they used to? I mean, I think they check yes if it's to your point in the context of the service that they are seeking. But a lot of times when you're checking out on a merchant page, do you opt into our emails? Do you opt into third-party emails? I never check the opt into third-party emails, and often may not check into emails from the merchant. I mean, I think now more about what I put the check mark, what box I put the check mark in, and I would imagine consumers do too.
Sure, but that's the first step, right? So consumers do, and what I mean is that's the first order awareness that, hey, I don't want my my information to be aggregated with others and sold to some random third-party marketing, entity that I don't know anything about. But what I'm talking about is in the heat of the moment and in a business context, an obvious heat of the moment is I'm in my accounting system and I want to get my data, I just want to reconcile my books.
Mhm.
So up it pops, provide us your login credentials at your institution so that we can facilitate this. Our experience is that, and as a business owner, the first thing I do, I know that this is providing my credentials, not just my data, but my credentials at my institution to a third party. But in the heat of the moment, it's a task and a job to be done, and I'm going to click yes.
And then you want the option to unclick yes at some future point in time. Is that what you're saying?
Sure. And I want someone to, I want to know that when I unclick yes, it actually is unclicked. And that's actually a good example because right now there's no unclick on that, right? That I can be assured other than, going in and changing my credentials.
And I think what you're saying is that there's no incentive for a third party to uncheck yes, or to ask you whether you still want to have the yes box checked.
Exactly. And that, who is going to be the provider that provides the control center of, who has your data, and provide you an aggregate view, who you gave access to, what data, when, and whether you'd like to revoke that. Very much a jump ball and open market for that opportunity.
So it's a jump ball and an open market for the opportunity. Who do you see filling that gap?
For consumers, I do think that the horse has left the barn, and that it is going to be big tech. One of pick your poison: Facebook, Apple, Google. For businesses and in more complex environments, I think that financial institutions are actually going to be the ones that are the fulcrum of business permissions, and allow businesses to control their data sharing and have an audit trail of it. Or I think financial institutions will have a very interesting role to play in that.
And so you think that consumers will be agreeable to letting big tech be the digital front door that then connects them to a variety of other services? It's interesting. I mean, our data does suggest that consumers want to simplify things, right? But they also want access to lots of different parts of an ecosystem that provide financial services, commerce, and other things associated with it. So it's because of the simplicity of the experience that they're interested in doing that.
I mean, consumers, of course, trust their financial institutions, but the ease of use and familiarity with the Facebook paradigm or the Google paradigm, I think, is so advanced that that's where, if I was a financial institution, I'd want to be playing in those ecosystems rather than trying to own it. But on the commercial side, from at small business up, I think banks are, have a great opportunity there.
So then what's the role of fintechs if that's the case on the business side of the ledger?
The role of fintechs is to partner with financial institutions to provide these delightful experiences, better use of the customer and the bank data, to have more efficient service, better internal controls, lower cost of payments, all those good things. So it doesn't mean that fintechs aren't part of the picture. It's that fintechs are participating in the platform ecosystems of major banks rather than banks needing to participate in the ecosystems of the major platforms.
Right. It's who is the, you don't want to say the dominant side of the platform, but who has more control over.
Yeah, and there's not going to be just one, right? So, there will be, I think, important ecosystems, business ecosystems, the Oracles and SAPs of the world will have a role there. So, but I think that the opportunity to not think of big tech as the major threat, and to think about, it's not disintermediation, it's not a defensive play on the part of financial institutions or threat reduction. We're seeing honest dialogues happening between banks and their customers about, what services are needed by customers to help them be more effective. And then banks having the luxury and opportunity to go about deciding how best to provide that service, which might include partnering with a fintech.
And why do you think the horse has left the barn on the consumer side? I mean, the business side it's a more complicated endeavor. It's, corporates do look to their bank for that kind of, set of services because they do trust it. And the nature of the information is very, very sensitive and complicated. So I see that. But you're convinced that banks have lost the battle on the consumer side.
I have, for the simple reason of log in with Facebook, log in with Google, like distributed OAuth. Consumers are so used to that one-click sign up for a new service, that unless banks, like I would be unlikely to adopt that from my bank, and my bank would be unlikely to distribute that capability widely enough for it to be useful to me as a consumer.
Right. And that's the other side of it too, right? It's the acceptance side of it. You can get to the door, but then what do you get when you open that door?
Exactly. Like if I get, in Canada, there is an experiment, and not an experiment, it's, I can log into the tax authority with my bank credentials. And it's been done in a very secure way, and it's great. And my bank will probably offer 2 or 3 of those kind of partnerships moving forward. And that's 2 or 3 out of the 200 or 300 that I use in the course of being a consumer.
Yeah, I do think it's a bridge really far for a consumer to take their bank account credentials and log into lots of different places with them. That is the keys to the kingdom, so to speak. Fascinating conversation, Lisa, on data transparency, and where you see things evolving both on the retail side and on the business side. I do agree with you that banks do have an opportunity to really lean in on the business side of the ledger for sure.
Thanks, Karen. I'm interested in it, and I'm watching the developments in Washington just like everybody else.
Yeah, I think we'll learn relatively soon what happens. So we'll circle back when we know more.
Awesome.
Thanks, Lisa. Bye bye now.
Cheers then.